that in the Times yesterday, I don't know if you saw it, about how synagogues around the country are finding that the rabbis are complaining that they just can't. Israel used to be a big issue.
Right.
They say now they can't raise it.
Right.
It's too divisive.
Right, right. And I guess, I wanted to make that the focus of this discussion, but I was sitting in my hotel room yesterday, and I put on. I was sitting in my hotel room yesterday, and I put on CNN, and suddenly the breathless coverage of the air assault on Syria began, and all the pundits came on. And they were congratulating themselves, or incredibly confident that they had this coalition with the UAE, Saudi Arabia, Jordan, Bahrain, and Qatar, and how this represents, one of them said, an inflection point. And we're going to hit him over the head with a 2x4, one of them said. And they were also really excited about the F-22s that were going to be used, and I think those are produced by Lockheed Martin, I'm not sure. And they were using all just the classic euphemisms that we've heard before. We're going to hit them where it hurts. We know where it is. So my question, I guess, is, what do you think the objectives of this mission is, apropos of ISIS? And when was the last time a sort of a coalition assault like this produced more stability in the region?
Well, first of all, it's kind of interesting on the side to note that this report that you described came out in the press alongside of the lead story in the New York Times about how the bombing of ISIS in Iraq has failed to hold any territory at all. That's how successful it is. And there's a reason. There's also a reason why the Iraqi army, which had 350,000 men, was very heavily armed, had been trained by the United States for a decade. Now, this is an army which had fought bitter wars, like the war against Iran, a huge war. As soon as they were faced with a couple of thousand lightly armed jihadis, the generals ran away, the troops threw down their arms, and they all ran away. Why? What's going on? This grand coalition, who is it? First of all, Bahrain is occupied by, basically occupied by Saudi Arabia. The UAE is a couple of, feudal lords. Saudi Arabia is the source of the jihadis. It's the source of the jihadi movement, both in funding and in ideologically. Their spreading of their extremist Wahhabi Salafi doctrine is the roots of the jihadi movement. You could listen to BBC this morning. They happened to listen to it driving in. They interviewed a top Iraqi security official asking about all these things. And he said, well, first of all, you can't have a coalition unless it includes Iran, because it's one of the most important countries in the region. The U.S., for ideological reasons, won't do that. Secondly, he said it can't include Saudi Arabia because of just what I said. Saudi Arabia is the source of the jihadi movement. Thirdly, he said it has to include Assad. We don't like him, but that's the only army fighting ISIS. Turkey, for example, refuses to participate. At first they said that they refused because they were hostages. Well,
and it's technically an aggressive strike because they haven't gotten permission. So regardless of whether or not the rebel...
But that's irrelevant. The one pundit who they don't have on, I presume, is the one who knows something, namely Patrick Coburn, who's been following this very closely. He's a fine journalist. They just had a book that came out on it, and take a look at it. And what he points out is you better clip this.
Oh, sure, yeah, let me help you.
Yeah. He says that the Wahhabization of Sunni Islam is one of the most dangerous phenomena of this millennium, and the past one. That's the source of, it's spread from Pakistan all over North Africa, Saudi Arabia is not only the most extreme radical Islamist force in the world, but it's also a missionary force. They pour money into establishing their madrasas, which are a substantial part of the source of the jihadi movement. That's why this Iraqi official said, until Saudi Arabia stops funding and ideologically promoting extremist jihadism, and how can they be part of a coalition? But they're the main U.S. ally. And the countries that ought to be part of it are not, like Iran. In answer to your question that this is a violation of international law, that's irrelevant, because that only applies to law-abiding states. But the United States is a rogue state. It dismisses international law. I mean, this is a minor example. That takes the invasion of Iraq. I mean, that's a radical violation of international law. When Obama, referring to Iran, says all options are open, that's a radical violation of the UN Charter. But none of this matters in a rogue state. It's like telling Osama bin Laden you're violating international law. What's the relevance? International law does not apply to the United States or to Israel, incidentally.
So speaking about Israel, so from what I understand, there are two sort of eras in Israel's history. There is, and I could be getting this wrong, there's pre-1967, when Israel, regardless of sort of the violence associated with statehood, was an aspiring country. American support of Israel wasn't significant or over the top. It was, in some sense, it was vulnerable, and it hadn't initiated the expansion and the settlements and the kind of aggressiveness that came after 1967 when they occupied the territory. And it seems like a lot of thinkers use that as an inflection point. And one of the rabbis that I kind of go back to is Yeshayahu Leibovitz, who was talking about how basically in 30 or 40 years we were going to be an apartheid state.
Beyond that, he said Israelis are going to become Judeo-Nazis.
Right. And so do you, and of course it's interesting this sort of debate between the rabbis, because of course there's this Rav Kook and the Greater Israel movement, and of course these rabbis who worried about Zionism informing state and political policy. And before 1967, from what I understand, it was a minimal sort of influence in terms of the rabbis at that point. So my question is, was it really sort of like 1 year, 1967 mark, like a significant difference in Israel's identity? Do you remember the time before and the time after as two distinctly different periods?
It's certainly distinct, much more than that. So for example, in 1964, I happened to visit Israel several times for an international conference and spent some time there. And it was kind of interesting that at that point, 1964, the term Tzionut in Hebrew among educated people was a term of ridicule. There's these people who talk about Tzionut, but we're not interested in that stuff. You come back 2 years later, it's awe and love. Yes, the 67 occupation certainly made a difference. Also made a huge difference, as you mentioned, in U.S. support. And 67, remember, Israel performed a huge service to the United States and to Saudi Arabia. It's kind of not talked about much, but at that time there was a major conflict in the region, was between radical Islam, centered in Saudi Arabia, and secular nationalism in Egypt. That was the conflict. And the United States, like Britain before it, strongly supported radical Islam. But traditionally, they've almost always supported radical Islam. Again, and secular nationalism is the threat. And there was a war going on between Saudi Arabia and Egypt and the Yemen at the time, kind of a proxy war, but pretty serious. Israel smashed secular nationalism. It defended Saudi Arabia. It met the U.S.-British goal of destroying secular nationalism. Remember, Nasser was compared with Hitler.
Right.
This was an immense service, and it changed. You take a look, yes, you're right, that's when U.S. support for Israel just exploded. It happened again in 1970. In 1970, U.S. aid to Israel, I think, quadrupled. Why? Because Israel performed another service. During the Black September, remember, Palestine and Jordan, it looked as though the Jordanian military forces were going to crush the Palestinians. Syria made some indication of moving to support Palestinians against the Jordanian attack. The U.S. was very much opposed to that, and so was Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia regards the Palestinians as a threat. The U.S. did not want anyone to interfere. This was right at the time when the U.S. was mired in Cambodia. It was impossible to talk about U.S. intervention at the time. The U.S. asked Israel to intervene. Israel mobilized its forces, which was enough to indicate to Hafez al-Assad that he had to back off, and they backed off. They didn't move on to support the Palestinians, or did get crushed.
So do you think 1967 gave Israel, the Six-Day War gave Israel a pretext to initiate plans to occupy all of Palestine, this was just a matter of time, and there was never this period that Israel was sort of content with the land they occupied?
Israel was never content. I mean, starting in 1949, Israel started expanding. At that time, they couldn't invade another country, but they expanded into the demilitarized zone. A lot of the so-called terror, remember in Hebrew, there wasn't a word for terrorist until years later. The people who were coming into the country were called mistananim, infiltrators. Later they were called mechablim, but that linguistic change signified an ideological change. I remember I was in kibbutz in 1953, going with friends up to guard service in the evening. Some of them wouldn't take rifles because they knew that the mistananim were just the people who lived there, who had been driven out, who were trying to harvest their own crops, and they didn't want to shoot them. Later they became terrorists, mechablim, the same people. But Israel was creating them. Israel moved into the demilitarized zones, drove out Bedouin groups. These were people who wanted revenge, and they did start carrying out terrorist acts.
So you said,
and this went on right up to '67. Moshe Dayan talked about it, like the struggles with Syria. As Dayan pointed out, he said, yeah, the conflicts with Syria begin when we encroach into the demilitarized zones, into what is regarded as neutral territory. The Syrians respond, and that gives us an excuse for a big attack on Syria. And what's more, all the UN commanders understood it. Read their memoirs. Every one of them came in very sympathetic to Israel. Every one of them left very hostile to Israel, because they could see all of this happening.
So I guess I have...
but it's quite different from post-67.
Yeah.
You're right.
One last question before Yalda has a few questions for you is, you've mentioned that when you and your wife were living temporarily at a kibbutz, this was before the kibbutz became a hotbed for nationalism and militarism, that it probably still had its sort of innocent anarchic socialist roots. Was that also like an inflection point in 1967 where the kibbutz became a kind of breeding ground for the type of nationalism that we see now in the country?
It certainly was a change. After 60, I mean, there were all kind of reasons, but the kibbutzim post-67 are quite different from what they were in the early 50s or the 40s. I mean, remember that a large part of the kibbutz movement, here, up until 1948, was opposed to the state. They were by nationalists. That's a big difference. That's when I was involved in the Zionist movement.
Right. Did you self-identify yourself as a kibbutznik, at least temporarily?
Well, I liked the kibbutz, and we thought of staying there, but it never would have worked. The reason was the kibbutz where it was considered the most left-wing in Israel. It was the center for outreach to the Arab community of Hashomer Tzair. It was way out at the fringe. But it was so Stalinist, you couldn't imagine. I mean, I lived with relatives who were Stalinists, and I grew up in the 30s and the 40s, but I never saw anything like that. They just worshipped Stalin. And this was particularly striking because it was in 1953. You may recall that that was the time of Stalin's last and violently anti-Semitic purge, the Chomsky trials in Czechoslovakia, which were directed against Jews. It was a real anti-Semitic outburst. One of the centerpieces in the Chomsky trial was a shaliach from the kibbutz movement, Mordechai Oren. This is like a family. They all knew him. They knew that he was innocent. You know, he was charged with being a spy for, this CIA, this, that, and the other thing. That was a centerpiece of the trial. They knew he was innocent. They justified the trials. I mean, this is beyond anything I'd ever seen. The ideological uniformity, everyone read the same newspaper, had the same thoughts. It happened to be passionately Stalinist at the time, at a moment when, for Jews to be Stalinist in the middle of a big anti-Semitic purge, when they knew that the guy who was at the center of it was being framed. That's pretty extreme. And in that kind of environment, I know I wouldn't have survived very long.
My first question is, what would you propose is the best method to bring about lasting change in the shortest time possible with respect to the Israeli-Palestinian situation?
I mean, what's been the barrier? There's everyone, you listen to John Kerry, Obama, everyone else, they say, look, everyone knows what the solution is. And basically that's correct. There's been an international consensus for 40 years on what the short-term, it's not long-term, nothing's ever a long-term solution, but what can be done right now to overcome the immediate problems. In fact, that proposal came to the United Nations in a resolution in January 1976.
Right.
You know that. By the Syria, Egypt, and Jordan brought a resolution to the Security Council calling for 2 states on the internationally recognized border, so-called Green Line, with guarantees for the sovereignty of each state and its right to exist within secure and recognized borders. That's basically it, the wording of UN 242. It was vetoed by the United States. Veto means it's out of history, so you're not going to find any reference to it in something I write, maybe. But you find virtually no reference to it. The U.S. vetoed the same resolution in 1980 under Carter. From then on, the U.S. has been blocking every effort to reach this settlement. And that continues to the present. The most recent U.S. veto was February 2011, when Obama vetoed a resolution calling for the implementation of official U.S. policy, namely stop of settlement expansion. Settlement expansion is not all that significant, it's the settlements that are the problem. But this was calling for an end to settlement expansion, U.S. official policy. Obama vetoed. Say take the latest Gaza attack.
Right.
Right in the midst of the Gaza attack, the world was very critical, not Obama.
Right.
He was critical of the rockets in Sderot.
Right.
That reaches American opinion entirely. This, I mentioned, I think, before, this article on the synagogue. Mm-hmm. Take a look at it. It's an interesting article. It's about the difficulty of talking about Israel. It's an interesting phrase in it. It says this became particularly difficult during the Hamas siege of Israel. You can't imagine that phrase appearing anywhere in the world.
Right.
The Hamas siege of Israel. But in the New York Times it appears, and nobody will even notice it, because the brainwashing of the American population reflecting U.S. policy, which is pretty standard, is extraordinary. And that's the problem. Until U.S. policy changes, Israel's not going to change its policies. Why should they?
But how do you reverse the U.S. policies, and how do you inform the American public?
You do, exactly the way it's happening. That article, in fact, indicates it. By now, there's enough dissidents, even in the fairly religious, not all that religious, but observant Jewish community, the part that goes to synagogues, enough dissidents even there that the rabbis can't bring up the issue. In the broader community, much more so. Take, say, colleges. I've been talking about these issues for 50 years.
Right.
I literally used to have police protection right here. At MIT, I had to have police protection. The police would not permit me to walk to my car without protection because of things they picked up about assassination attempts and so on. The meetings were broken up right here at MIT. It was a lot worse at other places.
Right.
That was until maybe 10 years ago. By now it is so changed that Palestinian solidarity is one of the biggest issues on campus. You get huge audiences, can't get a hostile question. Just a radical change. And it's seeping into the general community. It's a big job. And when you said, what can be done quickly? Well, the answer is nothing can ever be done quickly. But the efforts to try to break the ideological fanaticism that allows the New York Times to write blandly about Hamas's siege of Israel, efforts to break that can be carried out and are being carried out. Well, if the government has its own reasons for supporting Israel, nothing to do with us.
Right.
But and they'll keep those reasons. But even a totalitarian state can't disregard public opinion entirely. And a semi-democratic state like this, it's harder to disregard it. And I think that's the crucial point. Until American opinion changes enough to compel the U.S. government to join the world, not just on this issue, but this is one. Until that happens, I don't think Israel has any reason to change its policies. I mean, they attack Gaza, they start running out of weapons.
Every 2 years.
And the U.S. provides them more weapons.
Right.
And interestingly, notice where those weapons came from. They were pre-positioned in Israel for the use by the U.S. Army. They're there for the U.S. Army to use because the U.S. regards Israel as an offshore military base. Well, that's a reason for the relationship. But then in the midst of the attack on Gaza, when the arms ran low, Obama, he said he didn't do it, but the Obama administration transferred weapons over to Israel to continue the attack. But this happened during Cast Lead as well, the
Right.
last big attack. And right in the middle of Cast Lead, the U.S. was sending a shipment of arms to Israel. It had to go through Greece. And the Greek workers in the shipyard, in the port, refused to send it on. Well, but the U.S. was trying to rearm them in the middle of the attack. There was an effort at the UN to call for a ceasefire. The U.S. blocked it. Did again this time. That's normal. Well, why should Israel change its policies as long as the world's only superpower, which is a rogue superpower, supports it?
In Glenn Greenwald's book, he quoted
Who?
Glenn Greenwald.
Yeah.
He said, every oppressive state views mass surveillance as one of its most critical instruments of control. I know Iran has long imposed control and monitoring and surveillance of its citizens, prior to the revolution through Savak, now through the Islamic Republic. In America, we've now learned that the NSA surveils and monitors everything we do, from our telephone calls to text messages to our emails.
To this discussion.
To this discussion.
In fact, you have anything electronic on you,
Yeah.
you can be monitored. It doesn't even have to be turned on.
So, my question is, why is it that U.S. citizens, or not just U.S. citizens, but people in general, make a distinction between the surveillance in America and Association of America being a democratic state versus criticism of Iran, when Iran has been doing the same exact thing that the Americans are now implementing?
It's like asking why suppose Iran invaded Israel, or Syria invaded Israel. Well, you know what the reaction would be. What's the reaction when the U.S. invades Iraq?
Nothing.
Nothing. I mean, you get people like Obama, who is considered a courageous critic because he said it's not going to work. He said it's stupid. I mean, that's like Nazi generals who opposed the Second Front because they thought they ought to knock off England first. Do we praise them? That's Obama. But why can't you have a recognition in the United States, even when we carry out what's called the supreme international crime, the Nuremberg judgment. Supreme international crime is aggression. Goes on to say the supreme international crime differing from other war crimes because it encompasses all of the evil that follows, meaning ISIS,
right,
which is part of the evil that follows. Yeah, that's the reason why Nazi war criminals were hanged. Does anybody say Bush and Cheney and Rumsfeld ought to be hanged? No, I haven't heard it. Or even that they did it. The most you can say is they made a mistake, you know, or something, or they lied, or something like that. So why not ask that? The point is, this is a very brainwashed society, deeply indoctrinated society. You see it all over the media. You see it in the universities. You see it in scholarship. The United States is simply not treated like other states. We are separate. We're different. Normal standards don't apply to us. This is incidentally not unique to the United States. Every powerful state in history has been like this. So sure, the United States is like it. The United States has a history which has been very harmful to it. It's like what Leibovitz said about Israel. In '67, Yeshayahu Leibovitz, who he mentioned, warned the Israelis that they're going to become Judeo-Nazis. They're going to become Nazis, because that's the dynamics of victory. The U.S. is an unusual society. It has gone through its entire history defeating others, never loses anything. The reason it's kind of interesting that 9/11 was considered so shocking, because it was the first time since the War of 1812 that there'd ever been an attack on U.S. national territory. You know any other country like that? No, it's hard to find. Well, maybe someone in the South Pacific somewhere, on an island, but it's nothing like that. And a record of continual destruction of others is very harmful to the national character. I mean, the country, after all, was founded on genocide, extermination of the indigenous population, and slavery, which really never ended.
Right.
We're seeing the residues of it right today. Those are huge crimes. Does anybody face them?
I think you just mentioned to Yalda the irony of using the term siege to apply what Israel is undergoing. And it's the same way Israel refers to this as a defensive war when they're occupying a country. It's such an interesting rhetorical tool. It's almost what Orwell's term was, what was it? The doublethink.
Okay, but let me give you an assignment. See if you can find any aggressive war in history that wasn't justified as defensive.
Right.
So take, say, Hitler's invasion of Poland. Hitler, you read his speeches, he was defending Germany from the wicked terror of the Poles, the wild terror of the Poles. What could he do? The wild terror of the Poles was attacking Germany.
So, but my question is, how much of it, because I try opening books of logic, and they have this impenetrable math for me. I'm not a mathematician by any measure, but logic at its core is incredibly simple, right? So I always wonder to what degree the people speaking out and using rhetorical tools in such strange ways are actually making these significant errors in logic that they're not aware of. And if we're actually conscious of how many of our statements and observations are based in let's deal with that.
So was Hitler conscious that he wasn't defending Germany from the wild terror of the Poles? Was he conscious that when he said he's defending Germany against the Jewish Bolshevik conspiracy to destroy the white race, was he conscious of it? Well, I doubt it. And in fact, we even have evidence for that. Actually, I wrote about this years ago, but back in the 1960s, the Rand Corporation, connected to the government, released some very interesting materials, Japanese counterinsurgency literature, records of Japanese counterinsurgency in the 30s. And they're talking to each other, it's not propaganda. They were carrying out the most horrifying massacres and torture and destruction and slaughter. But you read the rhetoric, it's noble. It brings tears to your eyes. They're trying to bring an earthly paradise to the people of China who are being attacked by the Chinese bandits. And they have to defend the people of China by massacring a couple 100,000 people in Nanking. But they obviously meant it. They were only talking to each other. And if they could have meant that, why can't Americans or Nazis mean it?
Right.
In fact, sometimes I think it's probably conscious. Like in 1947, there was a decision to change the name of what we call the Pentagon. It was the War Department throughout all of American history. In 1947 became the Defense Department. As soon as you saw that, you knew from now on the United States is never going to be involved in defense.
Right.
And once you change it to the Defense Department, it's a War Department. That much must have been conscious. And it's the same in Israel. It's the Israeli Defense Forces. Okay, so Israeli Defense Forces. But every country, even Nazi Germany, was engaged in defense.
Great, thanks for your time.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much.
Can we take some photos with you? Can we take some photos with you?
Sure.
Thank you.